this is an overview of the history of American feminism, or at least a part of the history of American feminism. And it's organized by this metaphor of the waves, sort of this idea that feminist activity came in waves. It sort of would be very important for a while, it would sort of die away, and then it would be another wave that would bring it to central attention. It's not an entirely accurate metaphor, because even during the times when the waves died down, there were still feminists out there. But it's a useful way to talk about the history of the main feminist movement. Okay, the first wave, which was 1848 to 1920. And this movement comes from, in a lot of ways, from the abolition movement. Many of the women who become women's rights activists began by becoming involved in the abolition movement. And they saw their experience of the abolition movement and seeing the oppression and degradation of African American enslaved people. They saw that as something they could then use as a metaphor to think about the ways they themselves were oppressed and the limits that they faced and the restrictions that they faced, and so the ways in which they were sort of enslaved as well. And that becomes a perception that a growing number of women hold on to and see as important. And so they have a whole series of demands. And it's a big movement in the sense that there's many different female activists involved in it, and they don't all want the same things. So the women's movement really focuses on suffrage, particularly after the Civil War. That becomes the primary goal. And there is an additional thing that happens. Now, I said originally the American feminist movement comes out of, or the women's rights movement as they called it at the time, comes out of the abolition movement largely. The thing is that there comes the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, the Constitution, up until that point in time, had used the words persons, for example. They had not used the words men. Now, this was not because people writing the Constitution thought that women should have the right to partake in politics. That never occurred to them. But women's rights advocates had been arguing that they should have the right to participate because they are persons and citizens of the United States. But when they do the 14th and 15th Amendments, they specifically say men. And so black activists, for the most part, say, we have to take it. Yes, it would be better if it said women too, or at least some of the black civil rights activists say that, like Frederick Douglass. But we can't get that right now. We have to take what we can get. And what we can get is rights for black men. The women's rights advocates, most of them see this, the white women's rights activists, most of them see this as a betrayal. And so what we see developing is actually frequently a fairly racist way of arguing for rights for women, in that they often make the argument, look at these depraved people, these immigrants, these black men, these idiots, these insane men. You know, they're inferior. Why should they have the vote? And why then should not have a white, middle-class, respectable woman, why doesn't she get the vote to counterbalance them? And that becomes a common argument that is made. It wasn't an all-white suffrage movement. Many black women become members of the suffrage fight. The Black Women's Club movement embraces suffrage often, and individual black women create their own suffrage organizations. Now, the thing is, they are not allowed to join white suffrage organizations. So they have to create their own organizations. Black women do play an important role, and they see it as important for women to have the right to vote as women. They also see it as important for black women to have the right to vote because they see that as maybe black women would be able to get vote where black men couldn't and represent the black community that way. And by the way, there are also Native American activists, immigrant activists, all kinds of activists. So it's a bit like you have the official white movement that's marching along with the white women, and then there's all these other women that aren't in central stage but are involved in fighting for women to vote as well. Now, the great irony is that the belief was if women could just get the right to vote, they would become a major political force, and all the things that women care about, such as temperance, banning alcohol, which does go through, partly because they want to please women, potential women voters, morality, funding for things like children and mothers. This is when the Congress actually sets up a children's bureau in the federal government, once again hoping to appeal to female voters. The reality is that it turns out that women voters vote pretty much just like their husbands and other members of their community. So there is no great wave of female voters that changes politics. Instead, it subsides into pretty much just politics as normal, though there are a growing number of women who become involved in politics, often behind the scenes, local party organizations, though there are a few that run for office. So then there's the second wave, and this is what we think of as the women's movement that comes out of the 1960s. The main part of the movement sort of begins with activists coming out of the civil rights movement, a bit like it was activists coming out of the abolition movement. And once again, it's women who are part of the movement, and as part of the movement, begin looking at themselves and seeing the ways that they are oppressed, and thinking that that needs to take center stage, that we need to deal with the oppression that women face. And so this third wave of the women's movement starts in the 1960s, go to the 1980s, basically. I'm sorry, second wave, not third wave. A key part of it was consciousness raising. And consciousness raising was basically women getting together in groups and sharing their experiences and talking about that and realizing that things that they had thought of as individual problems, individual injustices, individual, maybe this happened to me because I was the wrong person, that actually there's a greater pattern. Because when it's just me, I was raped by my date, well, then maybe you think you were a bad girl or that you didn't behave correctly. But if you're sitting in a room and all these other women around you are saying, yes, I was raped too, or I was molested as a child, or if I was going in graduate school and there were scholarships going around, they gave it to the male candidates because they had to support their families. And as women, we didn't have to. Or when I went for a job, I wasn't hired because I was female. All these different experiences coming together and realizing that it's a shared problem. And this is this great quote about it. Nothing upside down to my world is much. I learned that maybe I wasn't so odd after all, because maybe, just maybe, patriarchal social constructions had caused the various forms of discrimination I'd experienced all my life, both as a woman and as a person of color. I was overjoyed. I embraced my new friend, feminism. Out of the new feminist movement comes a lot of theorizing and people taking their personal experiences and the experiences of the women around them and questioning the basic attitudes of society and challenging them. Three of the thoughts that become important later, or continue to be important, you're probably familiar with these concepts, are first of all, the personal is political. What happens to me as an individual, the kinds of oppression I face in my daily life, that is not just something that happens. That is not just natural, because that's what it's like for women. That is a result of a political system that structurally is determining how my life is lived and the rights I have, and the protections I have and the protections I don't have. The personal is political. And that shouldn't mean that it's just I'm in this for all I can get personally, but that I, based on my knowledge of my own self, but also based on my knowledge of the experiences of other women, ideally all other different kinds of women, we all can see that the things in our personal lives, our shared suffering, is the basis of political change. Gender versus sex. The idea that there is physical sex that you are born into, and I'm not going to touch the issue of intersexuality and the much more complicated ideas we have about sex and gender today, because it was still pretty simplistic back then. So the idea is we have sex. You're a man or a woman. But rather than saying that this is naturally how the world works for women and this is naturally how the world works for men, you say instead, look, societies are very different. What shapes your life as a woman is not your physical destiny because you're a woman. It's your gender. It's the way that your society treats women. It's the way it's organized. It's the way it develops. It's the role that it gives you to live. And so you want to talk about gender versus sex. And finally, structural sexism. That it's not a matter of saying, look, a bunch of those men are chauvinist pigs. Well, I mean, they tended to do that too. But that's not really the key issue. It's not that certain men are bad men and oppress women. The issue is the way that society is structured. There are incentives built in to cause men to control women and to benefit from the way the system operates, and therefore to have an incentive to keep the system operating as it is now. That's what needs to be dealt with. Now the problem is that a lot of white women take all of this and they think all women have essentially the same problems. All women are facing the same issues. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. A large amount of the feminist movement was white and middle class. And so for them, it's an issue of, I've not been allowed to get jobs. I've been forced to stay home and take care of children. I will be forced to stay at home and take care of children. I've not been allowed to go to college and study the things I want to study. But they assume that's the issues for everyone. And it really isn't. If you're a poor working class woman, the idea of being able to stay at home with your children would be liberating for many of those women, rather than having to work a dead-end job for long hours engaging in hard physical labor. For black women, once again, they face all kinds of restrictions because of race that aren't going to be dealt with if we simply make the changes based on sex and gender. So it's this myth of a monolithic sisterhood, that we're all the same. Reproductive knowledge and rights. So there's a whole bunch of things going into this. One is that whether or not you had access to birth control depended on the laws in your state. Second, you've got the issue of abortion. And abortion was more complex, the history of it in the 20th century, than we really are aware of. It varied extremely depending on who you were, where you were, and what your doctor happened to believe. So a middle-class white woman like my grandmother could get an abortion in the late 1930s for mental health reasons. And so she gets a safe, legal abortion. On the other hand, a single woman, a poor woman, who perhaps can't afford a doctor, or a doctor is not going to help because she's unmarried and she shouldn't be pregnant, may find herself trying to do an abortion herself or find someone in a back alley to help her. But out of the 1960s, two kind of movements come. First of all, there's a movement by anti-abortion people to try to make it harder to get abortions. And so really that anti-abortion movement really begins before Roe versus Wade. And there's another side of the movement, which is the feminist movement, which is saying, no, women should have access to abortion basically when they feel they need it. And that, of course, all changes with Roe versus Wade, which seems to say that women have won the abortion fight, and abortion is now going to be legal across the country. Not how it works out, but that's what they think. So things look like they're going well. And there is an Equal Rights Amendment that was first proposed in the 1920s. And it basically says that women have equal rights with men. And it was passing through the states. And everything was going really well. And that's when there becomes an active women's movement in opposition to the ERA, and more generally in opposition to feminism. Led by Phyllis Schlafly, a Republican and conservative lawyer. She's a very persuasive writer and speaker. And the movement grows. And there are enough women who are scared of what might happen with ERA to turn the tide against it. They're afraid that women will be drafted into the military, that there'll no longer be separate men and women's bathrooms. That bathroom argument keeps popping up historically. That men would have the right to divorce their wives and not have to pay alimony or child support. That all of these changes would take place in their lives, and they didn't want to see their lives change. And so the Equal Rights Amendment goes down to defeat. The third wave is what breaks out in the 1990s. And it's not really clear where it ends. And it's also not exactly clear if we're in a fourth wave currently. But there definitely is the third wave in the 1990s. Part of what's going on is that feminist changes had really become just in the background, assumed. As this quote says, for anyone born after the early 1960s, the presence of feminism in our lives is taken for granted. For our generation, feminism is like fluoride. We can scarcely notice that we have it. It's simply in the water. And the pictures are referring, of course, to Title IX, which says that if you're going to spend on male sports for boys and men, you have to spend on sports for girls and women. That's if you're an educational institution that gets money from the federal government. That's one big change, making women's sports accessible in a way they never had been before. But a lot of other things. The law had changed so that women have to legally be paid the same amount for the same job as men. That's not saying that it doesn't happen that they aren't paid the same amount, but at least legally they're supposed to be paid the same amount as men if they're doing the same work. Things like rape crisis centers, things like domestic violence shelters, things like the ability to make a criminal complaint against your husband if he rapes you. For a very long time, it was legal for a husband to rape his wife because that was simply him exercising his marital rights. All these changes were in the background. And so a lot of women and men would be very comfortable saying, I don't like feminism. I'm anti-feminist. But if you were to ask them, do you think that men and women should be paid the same amount of money for doing the same job? Most of the women would say yes. And not realize how amazing of a change that is from what was true in the 1960s. Another thing that's important that changes how feminism works in the third wave is technology and the internet. Our activism is inseparable from technology. We began our activism online. Blogs are consciousness-raising groups. Blogs serve the purpose of helping us figure out our ideology, have disagreements with one another, and figure out what actions might work best without having to all be in the same place. They've equalized feminism because you don't have to have the money to be in a women's studies class or be able-bodied enough to attend a consciousness-raising group every week or to stand on a picket line. What comes out of the third wave, feminism must be polyvocal. In other words, the idea is that you have to be aware that there are multiple points of view involved in feminism, multiple perspectives, and those should all be honored. It should be intersectional. In other words, it should be tied to other social justice movements, like disability rights movement, like all these other movements. And that it should be non-dogmatic, accepting the complexities of lived experiences. And that's some of what I drew on to put this lecture together.